China built the world's largest navy in just 11 years. Not the most powerful, that's still debatable, but the largest by hull count, 340 warships compared to America's 280 as of 2024. And if you think this is just about territorial ambitions in the South China Sea or preparing to invade Taiwan, you're missing the actual strategy. Because here's what nobody tells you. This isn't primarily a military buildup. It's an economic insurance policy disguised as a naval expansion. I'm going to walk you through the 3 strategic systems that explain why China prioritized naval construction over every other military investment, spending an estimated $230 billion between 2012 and 2023 to achieve what took the United States nearly a century. And once you see these 3 interlocking systems, everything from Belt and Road investments to South China Sea island building to even their approach to Taiwan starts making uncomfortable sense. My opinion? The West fundamentally misreads this expansion because we analyze it through our own historical framework, naval power as force projection. But China's building something different, a protective maritime envelope for the most import-dependent major economy in human history. Let me break this down using what I call the 3 pillars of maritime security framework, because conventional analysis focuses on what China's navy can attack. When the real question is what it's designed to protect, here's what the mainstream narrative gets wrong. Western analysts look at China's aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarine fleet and immediately frame it as aggressive expansion, the new imperial navy threatening freedom of navigation. But that analysis ignores one critical fact. China imports 73% of its oil, 83% of its iron ore, and depends on seaborne trade for 95% of its total trade volume. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China's economy is $18.5 trillion as of 2023. Of that, approximately 37%, roughly $6.8 trillion, is directly tied to international trade. Now, here's the vulnerability. 80% of China's oil imports transit through the Strait of Malacca, a choke point just 1.5 miles wide, at its narrowest point located 2,500 miles from mainland China and completely controllable by the US Navy or regional powers. This is what strategists call the Malacca Dilemma, and it's been keeping Chinese leadership awake at night since at least 2003, when President Hu Jintao first explicitly named it as a strategic vulnerability. The first pillar is what I call sea lane security architecture, and it explains the entire geographic pattern of naval expansion. When I spoke with a former PLA Navy officer in Hong Kong 2 years ago, off the record of course, he put it plainly, we're not building a navy to fight the Americans in the Pacific. We're building a navy so the Americans can't strangle us without starting World War III. That's the calculation. Deterrence through denial, not dominance through projection. Look at where China positioned its naval assets. The South China Sea isn't just about territorial claims to rocks and reefs. It's about creating a defensive buffer zone around the sea lanes that carry 64% of China's maritime trade. Every artificial island, every radar installation, every fighter jet deployment is designed to extend the range at which China can contest control of those shipping routes. But here's what makes this genuinely sophisticated. China isn't trying to control the entire Indian Ocean or challenge American naval supremacy globally. They're building what military analysts call an anti-access/area denial capability, a 2/AD. The goal isn't to project power to San Diego. It's to make it prohibitively costly for anyone to cut off shipping routes within what they consider their near seas. The specific deployments tell you everything. Between 2015 and 2023, China commissioned 23 Type 052D destroyers and 8 Type 055 cruisers, blue water vessels designed for long-range escort missions, not coastal defense. These aren't invasion ships, they're convoy protectors. Stay with me because the second pillar reveals why the timeline was so compressed, and it has everything to do with a window of opportunity that's already closing. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently. I call it the strategic window exploitation, and it explains why China compressed a century of naval development into just 11 years. Most people think China's rapid naval expansion was simply about economic growth, giving them the money to build ships. That's partially true, but it misses the critical insight. China identified a specific historical window between 2012 and 2023 when they could build a navy faster than anyone could strategically respond. Let me show you what this actually means. In 2012, the United States was war-weary from Iraq and Afghanistan, facing budget sequestration that cut defense spending by $487 billion over the following decade. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia was announced but never properly resourced. Meanwhile, Europe was consumed by the Eurozone debt crisis. Russia was still rebuilding from post-Soviet collapse. No major power had the attention, resources, or political will to counter a Chinese naval buildup that looked defensive rather than offensive. Here's my prediction. We'll look back at 2012 to 2023 as the decade China locked in permanent geographic advantages in the Western Pacific, and the moment when American naval supremacy became regional rather than global. China's shipbuilding capacity in 2023 was 23.2 million deadweight tons annually. That's roughly 232 times larger than the United States shipbuilding capacity of approximately 100,000 deadweight tons. Not 232%, 232 times. When I visited a shipyard in Dalian last year and saw 6 destroyers in various stages of construction simultaneously, a Chinese maritime engineer told me something that stuck. We build in 11 months what used to take you 3 years, and we have 12 shipyards doing this at once. The numbers are staggering. China launched its first Type 055 cruiser in 2017. By 2023, they had 8 in service. The US Navy's closest equivalent, the Zumwalt-class destroyer, took 17 years from first ship commissioning to having 3 vessels operational. China built 8 larger, more capable ships in 6 years. But here's what nobody tells you about this production capacity. It's not just about military hulls. China's commercial shipbuilding industry builds 52% of the world's merchant vessels. They took that existing industrial capacity, the trained welders, the steel supply chains, the propulsion systems manufacturing, the advanced electronics integration, and pivoted it toward military production without needing to build the industrial base from scratch. This connects to something even bigger, and I'll show you in a minute because the timeline correlates with something else. China's Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013, the same year their naval expansion accelerated dramatically. Let me give you a concrete example of how these systems integrate, because this illustrates why the naval build-up and economic expansion are inseparable strategies. Pakistan's Gwadar port, developed by China as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, sits just outside the Persian Gulf. It's officially a commercial port, but in December 2022, satellite imagery showed Chinese Type 054A frigates docking there for anti-piracy operations. The port gives China's Navy a logistics hub just 380 miles from the Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global petroleum passes. Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa, hosts China's first official overseas military base, established in 2017. It's positioned precisely along the route Chinese oil tankers take from the Persian Gulf through the Suez Canal. Cambodia's Ream naval base underwent Chinese-funded expansion starting in 2020, giving potential access to the Gulf of Thailand. Here's what I genuinely question. Did Western naval strategists understand that China was building not just ships, but a network of ports, bases, and logistics hubs that would make their navy operationally effective 5,000 miles from home? Because the ships are useless without that infrastructure. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because we need to talk about the third pillar. And this is the one that explains why this buildup is ultimately about economics, not conquest. Here's the uncomfortable truth that makes people deeply uncomfortable. China learned from history that the nation controlling sea lanes controls global commerce. And they decided they would never again be vulnerable to someone else's control. And once you see how this connects to their economic survival, the third pillar is what I call economic lifeline protection. And this is where military strategy becomes inseparable from economic survival in ways that Western analysts consistently underestimate. Here's what the mainstream gets wrong when they analyze China's naval expansion purely through a military lens. They're asking, what can China's navy destroy? When the real question is, what can China's navy prevent from being destroyed? And the answer is $6.8 trillion in annual trade that keeps 1.4 billion people employed, fed, and politically stable. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China consumed 15.4 million barrels of oil per day in 2023, but produced only 4.1 million domestically. That's an 11.3 million barrel per day deficit that must be imported by sea. A single day of disrupted oil imports cost China's economy approximately $1.4 billion in immediate economic impact, with cascading effects across manufacturing, transportation, and power generation. Now scale that vulnerability. China imports 1.1 billion tons of iron ore annually, primarily from Australia and Brazil, all seaborne. They import 110 million tons of soybeans annually for animal feed, 95% by ship. Natural gas imports reach 131 billion cubic meters in 2023, with 63% arriving as LNG via maritime routes. My opinion on what this really means: China built the world's largest navy because they looked at their import dependencies and realized a hostile power could economically strangle them in 30 days without firing a shot. Just close Malacca, blockade major ports, and watch 1.4 billion people face energy shortages and food security crises. But here's the part that should terrify American strategists. China doesn't need to defeat the US Navy in open combat. They just need to make a blockade costly enough that it's politically unacceptable. That's the entire strategic calculation. Let me give you the specific numbers that reveal this defensive posture. Of China's 340 naval vessels, approximately 140 are corvettes and fast attack craft, short-range vessels designed for coastal defense and sea lane protection within 1,200 miles of shore. Only about 45 ships are true blue water combatants capable of sustained operations beyond the first island chain. Compare that to the US Navy's 91 cruisers and destroyers designed specifically for power projection anywhere on Earth. China's submarine fleet totals 66 boats, but only 12 are nuclear-powered attack submarines capable of prolonged far-sea operations. The remaining 54 are diesel-electric boats, quiet and lethal in coastal waters, but limited in range and endurance. These aren't tools for global naval dominance. They're tools for making China's near seas a contested environment. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge. A navy designed to protect sea lanes within 2,000 miles of your coastline is fundamentally different from a navy designed to control oceans 8,000 miles away. China built the former, America maintains the latter. And in the Western Pacific, geography favors the former. When I spoke with a Singaporean defense analyst last year, he framed it perfectly. The question isn't whether China can beat America in a naval war. The question is whether America can sustain the political will to maintain a blockade when every week costs billions, risks escalation, and makes your own allies economically suffer. That's the asymmetry China is exploiting. A blockade isn't cost-free for the blockading power, especially when 30% of global container shipping transits the South China Sea, carrying goods destined for American and European markets. Here's what I genuinely doubt. I don't think the American public has been prepared for what defending Taiwan or maintaining freedom of navigation might actually cost in terms of disrupted supply chains, spiking energy prices, and sustained military operations in contested waters 7,000 miles from California. The economic integration isn't accidental, it's strategic. China handles 30% of global manufacturing output. Disrupting Chinese trade disrupts global trade. That's not a bug in China's system, it's a feature. It's deterrence through economic interdependence backed by sufficient military capability to make intervention painful. Let me pull this together and show you why this changes everything about Indo-Pacific security for the next 3 decades. So let me pull this together, because what we're witnessing isn't just a naval arms race, it's a fundamental restructuring of who controls the economic arteries of the 21st century. We covered the 3 pillars of maritime security: sea lane security architecture, strategic window exploitation, and economic lifeline protection. Individually, each pillar looks like standard great power competition. Together, they reveal what I call the commerce defense integration strategy, the realization that in the modern era, economic security and military capability are inseparable. Here's what matters. China didn't build the world's largest navy to conquer. They built it because they studied what happened to Japan in 1941 when America cut off 88% of Japanese oil imports and forced a desperate military response. They studied Britain's vulnerability during World War I and II when German U-boats targeted merchant shipping. They learned the lesson every import-dependent power eventually learns: if you can't protect your supply lines, your economy exists at someone else's mercy. This is the part that should surprise you. China's naval expansion is actually a sign of vulnerability, not strength. A truly self-sufficient power doesn't need 340 warships to protect sea lanes. China needs them precisely because they're not self-sufficient and probably never will be. Their geography, resource endowment, and population size make autarky impossible. When I was in Shanghai last year, a retired Chinese admiral told me something remarkably candid. We're not trying to replace America as the global naval power. We're trying to make sure America can never do to us what it did to Japan, what Britain did to Germany, what every naval power in history has done to import-dependent rivals, strangle them economically, and force either surrender or war. That's the whole strategy, not supremacy, survivability. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button because what comes next determines whether we see conflict or competition over the next decade. Let me give you 3 scenarios based on current trajectories. Scenario 1, contested equilibrium. China completes its naval build-up around 380-400 ships by 2030, creating a credible A2/AD bubble within the first and second island chains. The US maintains superior blue water capability, but accepts that the Western Pacific is now contested space, not controlled space. Both powers recognize mutual vulnerability, China to blockade, America to costly intervention, and reach tacit rules of engagement. Trade continues, tensions remain, but neither side finds conflict acceptable. This is the Cold War at sea scenario. Most strategists quietly hope for. Scenario 2, miscalculation crisis. A Taiwan contingency, South China Sea incident, or enforcement action around disputed waters triggers a naval confrontation neither side intended. China's newer systems haven't been tested in actual combat. American confidence in technological superiority meets Chinese confidence in geographic advantage and numerical superiority in their near seas. What starts as limited engagement escalates because neither side can afford to be seen backing down. Global trade routes freeze. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps insurance underwriters awake at night. Scenario 3, economic decoupling drives naval separation. As US-China economic ties weaken through reshoring, friendshoring, and deliberate decoupling, the mutual economic vulnerability that currently deters conflict diminishes. China focuses its navy entirely on securing routes to Russia, Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, resources and markets that don't flow through US influence choke points. America refocuses on Atlantic and Middle Eastern sea lanes. The global maritime commons fragments into separate spheres. This is slow-motion division of the world economy. Here's my prediction, and I'll state it plainly. Scenario 1 is most likely in the short term, but Scenario 3 becomes increasingly probable by 2035. Not because either side wants it, but because the economic logic that made globalization work, mutual benefit from integrated supply chains, is being deliberately dismantled by both Washington and Beijing. Here's my doubt. I'm not convinced either side has fully gamed out what happens when 2 nuclear-armed powers with massive navies operate in proximity with fundamentally incompatible political objectives around Taiwan. The stability of the past 40 years relied on overwhelming American naval superiority. That era is over. What replaces it is uncertain. So what should you take away? Not panic perspective. China built the world's largest navy in 11 years because they're terrified of economic strangulation, not because they're planning Pacific conquest. That makes them simultaneously less aggressive and more dangerous. A defensive power protecting perceived vital interests is often harder to deter than an expansionist one seeking optional gains. Subscribe if you want more analysis that goes beyond China bad or China threat narratives to understand the actual strategic logic driving decisions in Beijing. And comment your question, do you think naval conflict in the Western Pacific is inevitable, or can contested equilibrium hold? The ships are built, the strategies are deployed. The question is whether both sides are wise enough to manage competition without stumbling into catastrophe, because once you understand why China built this navy, you realize the real danger isn't their strength, it's mutual vulnerability in an interconnected world where neither side can afford to lose, but both sides are preparing as if they might have to fight.